Voi dovete impedire che un pugno di ruffiani e di frodatori riesca a imbrattare l'Italia. Tutte le azioni necessarie assolva la legge di Roma.
E l'arte è la più nobile delle imprese.
E qui vi uscì a rivedere le stelle.
Le storie e le azioni degli uomini eccellenti.
Dobbiamo meritarcela, la storia che ci è capitata. Qualcuno ce l'ha pagata. Non fu gratis.
E il naufragare del dolce in questo mare.
Tanto maggiori sono gli ostacoli e tanto più precisi e dritta deve essere la nostra volontà di superarli.
Io direi che è stato creato un grande patrimonio che appartiene alla collettività nazionale, appartiene a tutti gli italiani.
What perhaps makes Gentile's criticism of Marx so interesting is that he and Marx are both coming out of the same tradition of German idealism, and both had a deep understanding of Hegel, while they likewise both had their criticisms of him and other German idealists. So Gentile understands Marx better intellectually than nearly all modern so-called anti-Marxists do, and as a side note, most Marxists as well. And it isn't just going to try and debunk the Communist Manifesto by professing the so-called greatness of capitalism to maximize an individual's pleasure while warning about the dangers of big government. What makes Gentile's insight and criticism so refreshing from the glut of low IQ takes on Marxism is that he really takes Marx at his own terms and shows the integral flaws of Marx's philosophical doctrine just by referencing material Marx himself has written. In fact, even Vladimir Lenin, in an encyclopedia entry he wrote covering the life and philosophy of Marx in 1914, cites Gentile's work as supplementary reading, saying it's, quote, noteworthy, and that it, quote, deals with some important aspects of Marx's materialist dialectics, which usually escape the attention of the Kantians, positivists, etc. This occurred despite the encyclopedia entry coming to the polar opposite understanding of Marx's epistemology and metaphysics than Gentile did. Even more indicative of his understanding of Marx is that, at the time of his writings in the late 1800s, many of Marx's manuscripts were unpublished and wouldn't be published until the 1930s under an initiative by the Soviet Union. And, as we shall see later on in the video, Gentile's interpretation of Marx as a confused neo-Hegelian and not as a vulgar materialist was largely vindicated with the publishing of those manuscripts, and really lends credit to the ironic adage that Marx was a bad Marxist. Now, getting to the actual content of the essays, Gentile opens up with a discussion on Marx's philosophy of history, which is referred to as historical materialism in the essay, but is now more commonly referred to as dialectical materialism. At the time, there was a debate among Italian intellectuals, both Marxists and not, of whether or not historical materialism can really be classified as a philosophy of history in the same way that previous philosophers like Hegel or Vico had developed it. According to the glossary on the pro-Marxist website Marxist.org, they sum up dialectical materialism with the following quote from Friedrich Engels. Quote, "It is an eternal cycle in which matter moves, a cycle that certainly only completes its orbit in periods of time for which our terrestrial year is no adequate measure, a cycle in which the time of highest development, the time of organic life, and still more, that of the life of being conscious of nature and of themselves, is just as narrowly restricted as the space in which life and self-consciousness come into operation. A cycle in which every finite mode of existence of matter, whether it be sun or nebular vapor, single animal or genus of animals, chemical combination or dissociation, is equally transient, and wherein nothing is eternal but eternally changing, eternally moving matter, and the laws according to which it moves and changes." A less turgid definition from the dictionary defines it as the Marxist theory that political and historical events result from the conflict of social forces and are interpretable as a series of contradictions and their solutions. The conflict is believed to be caused by material needs. Actually defining and nailing down exactly what the term means can be a bit of a struggle, which isn't helped at all by the fact that Marx never used the term historical or dialectical materialism, and that Engels himself didn't even use it until after the term was coined by a fellow Marxist in the last years of Marx's life. And this struggle to define and properly understand it was part of the debate occurring in Italy, since the term was really deduced from a sort of hermeneutics of Marx and from Engels' work, who may or may not have understood Marx in the way Marx himself understood himself. This debate was also plagued by the fact, unbeknownst to the contemporaries of the time, that much of Marx's work elaborating on this topic, if merely tangentially, would remain unpublished until the 1930s. But when it came to the debate on historical materialism, Gentile lands squarely on the side that Marx's historical materialism is indeed a philosophy of history in the same vein as Hegel or Vico, concurring with Antonio Labriola, the leading Italian Marxist of the day, while disagreeing with the leading non-Marxist intellectual and friend of Gentile's, Benedetto Croce, who saw historical materialism as just an economic determinism which may be useful for a historian to better understand the past, but that ultimately, quote, cannot support either socialism or any other practical direction of life, and fails to be a philosophy of history because it's only concerned with explaining the past and is not concerned with what is necessary in the future. Gentile considers historical materialism a philosophy of history for two reasons I will elaborate on. The first is that Marx is viewed as inseparable from his Hegelian heritage, and although Marx attempts to correct and surpass Hegel, Marx is nonetheless very much using the Hegelian view of history as a base for his own theory. Second, and more specifically now, it attempts to describe the process in which history unfolds as a series of class or caste antagonisms and societal contradictions being resolved. Historical materialism does not, from Gentile's point of view, try to predict the future in the same way an astronomer may predict the time and date of an eclipse based on astronomical data. Rather, it's describing the process in which history unfolds. So, historical materialism deals with and can commentate on the past, present, and future, and it doesn't reduce itself to just being a historical tool that can only be used for post hoc explanations of the past. It is much more than just that for Gentile. And it is also for this reason that Gentile takes aim at Croce's other contention that not only is historical materialism not a philosophy of history, it, quote, cannot support either socialism or any other practical direction of life, and thus cannot serve as a revolutionary philosophy. To the contrary, Gentile contended that historical materialism, properly understood, is a revolutionary doctrine that could act as a rallying cry for communists. Marx didn't develop a specific system of ethics for communists to rally around, on par, for example, with Kantian, Christian, or Aristotelian ethics, and in actuality, historical materialism subjects ethics and morality to be a product of its time. But that doesn't make them any less important for each of these, quote, pivots of history where another contradiction is solved through social change, quote, also has a morality congruent with its real substratum. And communism itself is subject to dialectical materialism, where ethics are a byproduct of that society. In the communistic case, the ethics of the class struggle, since it itself is in a period of history, in trying to enforce its own pivot of history using its currently understood ethics. As Gentile himself writes, now what does it mean toward historical materialism as towards every philosophy of history that morality is a fact? Fact means history, and history is what historical materialism must study and elucidate, not what it must produce. It is its content, its presupposition, not its product, and what is presupposed cannot be denied. Thus conceived, historical materialism must account for itself and for the whole of life, and as in life, there is the beautiful and the good, and the ugly and the bad. It must explain the beautiful and the ugly, and the good and the bad, that is, it must assign them a legitimate place. Thus far, it may sound like Gentile is praising Marx and his theories, and to an extent he actually is. Reading the essay itself, the tone comes off as if he is trying to salvage everything that he can from Marx's theories, and he defends him several times for what he views as more off-base critiques. In fact, it's only the last few pages of this essay where Gentile actually starts to critique Marx. Up until this point, he has mainly focused on either defending Marx through the way he views him, which isn't necessarily the quote-unquote orthodox Marxist view, or he is simply explaining and trying to understand what Marx is getting at, and attempting to understand the man at his own level. But here comes his actual criticism of historical materialism and what makes Gentile's critique so unique. So although Gentile agrees with Labriola that historical materialism is a philosophy of history, the biggest failing of historical materialism is that the actual way it describes the historical unfolding is full of problems and contradictions on its own terms. Marx's philosophy of history is derived from Hegel's philosophy of history, but with some major caveats. The main difference Gentile sees is that the relative is made to play the role of the absolute, and instead of the absolute being immanent in all of reality and the real, the absolute is claimed to be imaginary and effectively non-existent, while the relative becomes immanent and real. To phrase this without all the jargon, matter, i.e. the material and empirical world, takes the role of the immaterial mind, which the idealist school, which both Hegel and Gentile belong to, believes creates the world and is the basis of reality. And instead of the mind, or the absolute, developing dialectically, which propels Hegel's philosophy of history, matter, and the empirical itself, is to develop dialectically and to fuel the engine of historical materialism and the Marxist philosophy of history. But the problem arises in that the material world, in Marx's case the economic facts of a society, is not the proper subject of philosophical prediction. Hegel's historical philosophy works because the absolute, or spirit, is not about material reality like vulgar materialists like Lenin believe in, but rather it's about the immaterial mind. Hegel talks about the historical development of spirit, not matter. The absolute is a philosophical concept that embeds itself in all of reality and thus can be the proper subject of philosophy, and it can be explained how the absolute develops dialectically. But when a philosophy is describing the projection of the relative of matter, it has sunk to the level of the astronomer predicting eclipses and falls short of being a proper philosophy. Fundamentally, a philosophy of history is based on making a priori claims about what is going to happen. But if your a priori claims are about matter, or the relative, then you are reduced to historiography and predicting events, and you are not at the level of metaphysics or philosophy generally speaking. Instead, if you wish to be at the level of metaphysics when it comes to history, you have to rely on something that is above matter, but which also moves matter, not because the matter itself is changing, but because the absolute is dragging the matter with it. This is exactly Hegel's conception, where the absolute moves dialectically and drags matter along, but the absolute is never changed by the relative. Gentile concludes by calling Marx's history, quote, one of the most wretched deviations of Hegelian thought. And this is what makes Gentile's criticism of historical materialism so damning but also unique. He shows that Marx is indeed trying to create a philosophy of history and would actually have created one if the mechanics of it were logical and consistent. But instead, Marx's materialism plagues him just enough to have him attempt to create a metaphysics that must be based off something non-material, like Hegel's absolute based off the mind, just to have his materialism stop it from being actually plausible. And this problem of Marx rejecting materialism just enough to accept idealist precepts but not enough to reject materialism creates this weird philosophical golem riddled with internal contradictions and logical problems which strive for so much but fail so much. And it's this confused idealism that is muddied with materialism that Gentile is really critiquing Marx about. We'll see in the second half later here how Marx again comes close to coming up with a coherent philosophy just for it to be ruined again by the subtext of materialist metaphysics. So, in the second essay about Marx that Gentile wrote, he begins with what are known as the thesis on Feuerbach, which were 11 bullet points that Marx had written down for a future project he wanted to do regarding Feuerbach, but he never got around to doing it. In total, it's about 700 words, and they end with one of Marx's more famous quotes about how it's the role of philosophers not to merely describe the world, but to change the world. To give some context though, Feuerbach was born about a generation after Hegel and became one of the leading left Hegelians and developed a very materialistic and human-centered philosophy. He was, generally speaking, influential and likewise influential on Marx and Engels, and it is where we get the concept of alienation from actually. However, Marx still had his criticisms of Feuerbach, which we can see in a primitive form in the theses. And it's from Marx's criticisms of Feuerbach's vulgar materialism, which itself has certain traces of idealism, which Giovanni Gentile sees Marx as espousing a philosophy of praxis, a concept Gentile himself would later develop in a properly idealist manner later in his career. But praxis is not a new concept to idealism, and Gentile actually traces it all the way back to Socrates and Plato, but says it is, quote, new with respect to materialism. So what exactly is Marx's philosophy of praxis? Well, praxis, generally speaking, is defined as practice as distinguished from theory, or more specifically, it might be better defined here as a sort of human action. Gentile writes, in Marx, praxis is synonymous with human sensory activity. Marx's praxis is also noteworthy in that it denies other theories that posit the subject and object as two abstract concepts, and instead has them inseparably linked to each other so that their actual reality results from their relationship to the organism in which and through which they find their necessary fulfillment, and outside of which they are nothing but abstractions. Gentile elaborates on his interpretation of Marx, saying that for him, reality is a subjective production of man, a production, however, of sensory activity, not of thought, as Hegel and other idealists believed. In other words, Marx believed that the praxis or the action of human sensory activity, the active process of taking in stimulus through our senses, is the basis of our reality. Reality is the subjective production of man and his sensory activity. Elucidating his point, he calls Feuerbach out for deducing humans to be products of the environment and education. Marx does indeed believe that humans are a product of their environment and their education, but he adds on the important corollary that humans can change their environment and education, and that there's a mutual relation between the subject, humanity, and object, or the environment. And with this, Gentile has exposed another Hegelian or idealist streak in Karl Marx, and a certain dialectic is formed with subject and object interacting with each other, which changes both the subject and object, and so on repeat. Except it's not Fichte's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Rather, for Marx, the thesis becomes circumstances / the environment, antithesis is education, and the subject modified by the two becomes the synthesis. Nonetheless though, although Marx is against the vulgar materialism of Feuerbach, Gentile still considers his metaphysics to be materialistic monism, which is distinguished from any other similar system by the concept of praxis applied to matter. In Marx's metaphysical scheme, what we have is Hegel viewed through the lens of materialism, where instead of spirit or mind we have the body, and instead of idea we have sense, which produce not true reality as Hegel posited, but instead economic facts, which are the products of human sensory activity in the search for the satisfaction of all those material needs. For Marx, all information external to the subject is interpreted through sense, which is received as sensation of some sort, either visual, audible, tactile, etc. So Marx is like the materialist of old in that he sees the world as composed of merely matter, as a good materialist does. But his Hegelian background doesn't allow him to see matter as static, but rather it's seen as dialectically dynamic, and thus changing. Since matter is changing and not merely static, Marx can elaborate on a philosophy of history, although it has the logical problems that we talked about earlier in this video. However, problems will soon arise with Marx's materialism with Hegelian characteristics. For example, the philosophy states that sense is the principle of reality, and that all the information we perceive from the external world outside our subjectivity is filtered through our senses, which come to us in sensory data of some sort, either the visual, audible, tactile, etc. But Gentile asks the question of who produces this data, this outside or external information? Gentile asserts that the sense creates the sensation, since outside the mind, beyond the external information, there is nothing except purely physical fact. And whatever makes or creates these facts, or as Gentile puts it, the vibrations of the ether, is outside the purview of human sensory activity, which Marx makes as the building blocks of his metaphysics. In other words, matter is outside of sense. This shows that Marx's theory of sensory praxis is not even able to justify the existence of matter, and it tears down the entire metaphysical foundations of Marx. Another issue brought up by Gentile is that by even arguing for the existence of a philosophy of praxis, you are already transcending sensible reality, since you are arguing for the existence of something immaterial and metaphysical which is not perceptible by the human senses. This is, however, possible through pure idealism, such as Gentile would develop later through his actual idealism, where a praxis of the act of thinking is the basis for his metaphysics, and everything becomes mind. Specifically, everything is thought. For if thought alone is real, then Gentile doesn't have to worry about what's outside of the purview of our mind, for the mind alone is reality. What Gentile's criticisms of Marx ultimately comes down to in the final analysis is that materialism mixed with idealism is an untenable reality. Marx failed to surpass Hegel and instead created an incoherent philosophical system that takes elements of idealism and materialism and makes the system internally contradicting by its own standards. Gentile doesn't have to cite history or economics to deal with problems of Marx, he simply reveals its own internal mechanisms are philosophically bankrupt. If you notice throughout the video, I refrained from using the word Marxist or Marxism, and that is for a reason. Marxism as an ideology that developed after the death of Marx, with thinkers like Engels and Lenin claiming to be the true heirs to Marx, is not the ideology that Gentile sees in Marx. Gentile sees Marx as a weird fusion of materialism and idealism, while Engels and Lenin wrote about Marx's materialism while leaving out his idealist tendencies. For instance, in Lenin's 1909 book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, a book that would later be mandatory reading in higher education in the Soviet Union, he writes that sensation depends on the brain, nerves, retina, etc., i.e. on matter organized in a definite way. The existence of matter does not depend on sensation. Matter is primary. Sensation, thought, consciousness are the supreme product of matter organized in a particular way. Such are the views of materialism in general and of Marx and Engels in particular. And in the 1914 encyclopedia article where Gentile is referenced, Lenin writes that Marx decidedly rejected idealism. Lenin's view of Marx is unmistakably at odds with Gentile's view of him. Gentile saw him as constituting his entire metaphysics on the activity of sensation which interacts with matter through receiving it through the senses. The subject and object world weren't two abstract ideas, rather they were dialectically intertwined where one cannot exist without the other. A stark contrast to Lenin's view, which he attributes to Marx that, quote, consciousness is the supreme product of matter organized in a particular way. However, as I mentioned at the start, at the time of both the writings of Gentile and Lenin, much of Marx's works were yet to be published and wouldn't be so until the 1930s by the Soviet Union. Some of the more notable works to be published included economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 and the German ideology. The manuscripts of 1844 specifically goes to show the idealist tendencies of Marx that Gentile was able to pick out just from some notes on Feuerbach that Marx had written down on a journal. These uncovered manuscripts and these uncovered works would see no defense of a vulgar materialism or crass materialism like the likes of Lenin would write about, and even go so far as to attribute to Marx himself. The intellectual historian Gareth Stedman Jones shows how Marx's more idealistic side has been suppressed, writing in his biography on Marx that, indeed, these several writings of the young Marx show that Gentile had a better understanding of Marx from Marx's short thesis on Feuerbach than Lenin did. He writes that, quote, according to Engels, Marx developed his new materialist conception of history between his completion of the Holy Family in the autumn of 1844 and his reunion with Engels in Brussels in the spring of 1845. During these months, Marx did not publish anything. The only piece of relevant documentation, which Engels discovered when going through papers dating from that period, was a 2-page entry in one of Karl Marx's notebooks entitled Ad Feuerbach, or now known as the Thesis on Feuerbach. Jones then goes on to describe how the notes on Feuerbach actually attack the traditionalist materialist school rather than support it, and takes much the same view on them as Gentile had over 120 years ago. He also describes that this lack of support for the materialism touted by Engels and Lenin was a problem for the Soviet Union, and that to solve this problem, in publishing of the German ideology, archivist and Marxist in the Soviet Union, David Razanov, wrote a chapter called I, Feuerbach. And now I quote from Jones, but it has recently been demonstrated that it was factitiously put together by Razanov and his associates in the 1920s. The purpose of its publication during the early years of the Soviet Union was to complete the exposition of Marxism as a system by connecting what Marx in 1859 had called a process of self-clarification with Engels' claim about Marx's development of the materialist conception of history in 1885. So in short, the Soviet Union forged chapters and claimed they were written by Marx in order to make it sound like Marx supported the crass materialism of Lenin and Engels and the Soviet interpretation of Marx, generally speaking. We see further support of Gentile's interpretation of Marxism in an introduction to the manuscripts of 1844 written by Italian Marxist Lucio Coletti, who writes, "The immediate reasons for the resistance and perplexities they aroused in Marxist circles were certainly of a theoretical nature. It would be a needless exaggeration of the case to ascribe the reaction directly to political factors. Nevertheless, the sheer rigidity of official doctrine, the rigor mortis which already gripped Marxism under Stalin, contributed in no small way to the cool reception which the writings met with when they appeared, to the absence of any debate about them, and to the manner in which they were immediately classified and pigeonholed. What made the manuscripts of 1844 appear so out of line with Marxism was their profound dissimilarity to dialectical materialism. They said nothing at all about the dialectics of nature, nothing which prepared the way for Engels' theory of the three basic dialectical laws of the universe." Coletti also brings up how in East Germany, the manuscripts of 1844 were subtly repressed by not being included in the larger volumes of Marx that were published, and instead publishing them as standalones. Lastly, I will bring up a point the historian A. James Gregor does, which supports the idea that Marx and Engels' philosophies were not totally in sync with each other. Gregor writes that, "We do know that Marx did not confide all his opinions to Engels, and what the judgment on the epistemology of his compatriot might have been we shall probably never know, since Marx's daughter took it upon herself to destroy her father's correspondence with his wife, a vandalism undertaken in order to avoid embarrassment to Engels." So with this, I believe there's enough evidence to say that Lenin and Engels interpreted Marx wrong, and that Gentile has the correct view, and that his interpretation doesn't fall on deaf ears since he is critiquing the real Marx and not Marxism as an official brand of Lenin and Engels, who I have believed to show got Marx very wrong in many key aspects. To wrap this video up, I will let Gentile have the final say. We will say, therefore, in conclusion, that an eclecticism of contradictory elements is the general character of this philosophy of Marx's, of which some of his disciples today are perhaps not greatly wrong in not knowing what to do. There are many fruitful ideas at its foundation, which, taken separately, are worthy of meditation, but isolated they do not belong, as has been proved, to Marx, nor can they justify that word Marxism, which is thought to be synonymous with a purely realistic philosophy.
Di anticipare una parte della domanda successiva, quindi anche lo stesso Marx che viene da Gentile sino al suo maestro breve spostato dagli archivi del materialismo all'archivio invece dell'idealismo, non è anch'esso qualcosa di scandaloso e che però potrebbe darci una mano a noi per elaborare un anticapitalismo più maturo, più vero, e non invece quegli anticapitalismi fallimentari di cui considerava Marx un materialista e che ogni riferimento a tutti i tesserati del vecchio partito comunista non avete voluto.
Sì, questo è un problema teorico della massima importanza, cioè la natura filosofica dell'impianto categoriale di Karl Marx. Marx, dal mio punto di vista almeno, non è un materialista, ma è un idealista al 100%. In che senso? Bisogna capire innanzitutto cosa vuol dire idealismo. Ora, non è questa la sede per fare una lezione sull'idealismo tedesco, però mi limito a riprendere molto rapidamente, in maniera telegrafica, la distinzione fra realismo e dogmatismo, se volete, tra realismo e materialismo, che aveva elaborato a suo tempo un grande pensatore idealista, Fichte, il quale diceva che in fondo, in ultimo, la distinzione tra materialismo e idealismo sta in ciò che per il materialismo esiste un mondo oggettivo dato a cui noi dobbiamo corrispondere. Sta lì, è fermo, è materialmente dato, è realmente dato, e noi siamo determinati da quel mondo e dobbiamo adattarci ad esso. No? Dobbiamo adattarci conoscitivamente ad esso, rispecchiandolo così com'è, adequatio rei intellectus. e dobbiamo adeguarci adesso politicamente lasciandolo essere così com'è. No? C'è una sorta di identità tra l'accertamento e l'accettazione, tra l'accertamento conoscitivo e l'accettazione sociopolitica. Laddove invece, diceva Fichte, l'idealismo è quella filosofia che muove dall'io libero e indipendente, l'io che crea il suo mondo, l'io che si oggettiva nel mondo della produzione, nel mondo sociale, storico, e che sempre agisce per trasformarlo. Se il materialista deduce l'io dal mondo oggettivo, l'idealista invece deduce il mondo oggettivo dall'io, cioè dall'attività autonoma del genere umano che si oggettiva nella storia. Ora, Marx è idealista esattamente in questo, sarò breve, nel fatto che recupera e declina da un punto di vista appunto filosofico, comunistico, l'idea propria dell'idealismo tedesco dell'identità di soggetto-oggetto. Cosa vuol dire questo? Vuol dire che tra il soggetto, l'umanità pensata come un unico io, e l'oggetto, la serie delle oggettivazioni storiche umane, deve darsi identità, cioè appunto l'umanità deve agire per rendere conforme a sé il proprio mondo oggettivo. E appunto questa è opera di una prassi che si determina nella storia. Il mondo oggettivo non corrisponde al soggetto, anzi il mondo oggettivo di cui siamo abitatori oggi è massimamente distante dalla corrispondenza con noi come soggetto vitale dell'umanità. È il mondo in cui l'umanità è negata nel nostro mondo. Il termine che Marx diceva alienazione. Il fatto cioè che l'umanità è straniera a se stessa e al mondo in cui vive. Si tratta appunto di produrre l'identità di soggetto-oggetto riconducendo all'ordine della ragione umana tutti i prodotti storici e sociali di cui siamo abitatori. Questo è in estrema sintesi il tema del soggetto-oggetto marxianamente pensato a partire dall'idealismo. Cioè appunto Marx è un idealista al 100% perché pensa che il mondo oggettivo sia un prodotto sociale storico e che l'identità soggetto-oggetto sia mediata dalla storia, dalla temporalità e dalla prassi umana. Se si leggono le 11 tesi sul foglio di Marx, ci si accorgerà che batte al centro di questo progetto un cuore idealistico. La cifra dell'idealismo sul piano ontologico, anzitutto, è quella della defatalizzazione del mondo oggettivo. Il mondo oggettivo non è dato, ma è un prodotto. In quanto tale può essere cambiato. Il mondo oggettivo l'abbiamo prodotto, non lo possiamo trasformare. Questo per gli idealisti valeva sul piano anzitutto ontologico. Non esiste nulla oggettivamente se non tramite l'azione del vostro pensiero che lo sta pensando e quindi ponendo. No? Per questo per inciso ogni realismo è sempre ingenuo, lo diceva Gentile. Il realismo è sempre ingenuo perché pensa che il mondo oggettivo esiste e si dimentica che quell'esistenza è già sempre mediata dal pensiero che lo pensa, sul piano conoscitivo ontologico. Ma sul piano sociale e politico l'idealismo dice esattamente che il mondo oggettivo, le leggi della finanza, dell'economia, le leggi della società, sono l'esito di una posizione umana e quindi non hanno nulla di definito, possono essere trasformati. No? Citando un bellissimo passo di Shakespeare, del Giulio Cesare di Shakespeare, in cui Cassio si rivolge a Bruto, dice: vedi caro Bruto, non è nelle stelle ma è in noi la colpa se noi rimaniamo degli schiavi. Se siamo schiavi oggi è colpa della nostra attività che precipita in forme di accidia e di inerzia, cioè a riappropriarsi della consapevolezza del mondo oggettivo come prodotto della prassi sempre